Bom dia a todos. É um prazer retomar nossos encontros de poesia ao meio-dia, organizado pela Cátedra de Estudos Irlandeses, W.B. Yeats. E hoje é um dia muito especial também. Susan Roy, que sempre dirige nosso programa, tem nos dado esse espaço para poder receber aqui a professora Gisele Wolkoff, da Universidade Federal Fluminense, em Rio de Janeiro, que está dialogando, irá dialogar com a grande poeta irlandesa Celia de Fréine, aqui presente nesse estúdio. Então, eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Gisele, que vai dialogar com a Celia de Fréine, e dizer a todos que retomamos, então, nossos encontros toda quarta-feira, última do mês, junto com também Susan Roy, como fazíamos nos meses anteriores. Enjoy your time here with Celia and Gisele.
Thank you very much, Professor Laura and William Butler Yeats Chair of Irish Studies. Thank you, Celia de Fréine, for accepting being with us, taking your time, for letting us know more about your poetry, and for all those watching, our thanks. It's a great honor having Celia de Fréine with us because she's widely prized. She has 10 books of poetry, and she also writes theater. She writes for the screen, for TV, for which she has also been prized largely. And she writes in both English and Gaelic, which is something for us to think about as we are in Brazil studying Irish culture. So we have a lot to learn from the poet. Without much delay, I just want to say a few titles that concern her writing. Lesson in Kent, Blood Debts, Riddle Me This from 2014, Alphabet of an Age, 2011, Inran Odyssey, 2010, and the first book with which I had contact, Scarecrows at Newtonards. Over the years, we kept meeting here and there, from Dublin to Galicia and even Japan. And now she's in Brazil remotely, in the hope that she joins us someday presentially. So with you, Celia, I pass on the word to you to let us know more about your writing. And you've sent us 4 beautiful poems. So if you can give us also the honor of reading them and maybe commenting on the poems, we'll be most glad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gisele, for that wonderful introduction. And indeed, it's an honor to be here and to be speaking to you. And thank you to Laura and Esther and everyone who's involved in putting this presentation together. Yeah, as you mentioned, Gisele, yes, I've written 10 books of poetry. I've also written for screen and for stage, and I've written some fiction as well. And the thing is that, like, I find while I keep everything going, I'm always working on something, but, you know, sometimes a genre might slip away. Like, for instance, in, say, up to 2 years ago, I was working, I wrote a biography and I wrote a novel. And before that, I was writing plays which were being performed, many of them short, never write another poem, and I began to worry about that. And so then when the pandemic hit in March of 2022, I began to think, you know, yes, I began to feel the need to write about what I was feeling at the time. And being an elderly citizen of Ireland, I wasn't allowed to leave the house, my own property, the house and garden. So I was basically stuck at home. But this wasn't a bad thing because there were other people stuck at home with me and other people who could come and go. and there was plenty of room in the house and there was plenty of room in the garden. But the loss of freedom kind of really cut into me, and that facilitated my return to poetry, if you like. And this most recent book of poetry is called Leis Lína a Lorug, In Search of a Horizon. And what I missed most of all was the sea, going down to the sea and looking out to the horizon. And excuse me. So that's one of the ideas behind the poem. So shall I read a poem, Gisele?
Yeah.
Or shall I talk more?
Can I ask you? Yeah, I'll give you the word for the poems, but I just forgot to say, among the 10 books, the latest one is In Search of a Horizon, that I had the honor of reading as soon as Celia de Fréine was writing the poems. So Marina and I started translating some of the poems. Even some of them are there. But I got curious by rereading your previous works when you say that writing is not only a way of acknowledging more about ourselves, it's a way out. Mm-hmm. Which confirms what you have just told us, right? I mean, as you were encapsulated in your own home, one way out was writing. So I'm really fascinated by the new In Search of a Horizon, New Horizons, and whatever you want to tell us about them. I think two of the poems are dedicated to someone very special to you.
Mm-hmm. Two of the poems, the whole book is dedicated to my two granddaughters, and two poems are dedicated to the two girls, one of whom was born during that time when I was confined to the house. Her parents had been in their apartment, and then they moved in with us when the pandemic hit. So we were all looking after each other, and they had the freedom to come and go, so they could go to the shop and buy groceries and things like that. And also then one day they went to the hospital and came back sometime later with this beautiful baby. So shall I read? Shall I start by reading one of the poems?
Yes, please.
Okay, this poem is, and the frightening thing about the pandemic was, every time we turned on the television or the radio, it was so many people have lost their lives. And then you would hear, well, those figures weren't right. There were other people that we didn't add in and other people we forgot about, and so on and so forth. And I found all of that so disconcerting, that people that the facts or the numbers, that they would be so, if you like, carelessly. At the time, I remember I was reading some poetry by Wisława Szymborska, and I found I couldn't focus on it, reading about her characters, the characters in her poems, and then turning to the newspaper and reading about characters who had lost their lives, who were just like statistics, or that were kind of misrepresented, if you like, on news bulletins. So I'll read that poem then. Facts, scentless, accurate though not definitive, in that they might not indicate the full extent of the disaster. A lull might occur one day when deaths in a nursing home are not included, a spike another day that comprises hospital figures that stretch back 2 months. Each day I skip over poems that celebrate life, when all it takes is mention of an anecdote to animate those lost. The way he might doff his hat, the way she loved to go dancing, dressed in a taffeta gown and patent leather shoes. It was just the feeling of all those lost souls who died in hospital, in nursing homes, and some of them at home in their own homes as well. Shall I continue with another poem then?
Yes, yes, please. We can always go back to the poems after the reading.
Yes. This one is called Those On-Screen Streets. And I think we all have memories of cities and Shelley standing on the steps of a cathedral in a deserted city, and the whole surrealness of it. And it reminded me of Christmas when I was a child, that the city of Dublin would be deserted because everyone was at home. Whereas now it isn't, because there are so many people who don't observe Christmas, and there are so many shops that open the day after Christmas. So you never get that same feeling. But I felt that during the pandemic. And another thing about it was that there was a fox, like we kept seeing on news reports, this fox going down Grafton Street, which is one of the shopping areas of Dublin. And it was totally bizarre seeing this fox, right, passing by all these shops. And the other thing worth mentioning is that it was very warm at this time. And for instance, we have this climbing plant, this clematis, which normally flowers in May, flowered in April. So all of those ideas are in this poem. Those on-screen streets. The streets are calling, those near empty boulevards of Christmas long ago, when everyone stayed home and shop windows flaunted their wares, ready for the sales to begin. How I long to inhale that fresh air, listen to the bird song, cut through the expanse. A fox. One thing I am sure of, however, as soon as my soles touch those cobblestones, the crowd will be there before me. Fumes will have invaded the air. Birdsong will have died out. The fox will have returned to his lair in the suburbs. Meanwhile, pears bud in the garden, clematis wavers on the railings, and the back gate remains locked. So I still couldn't get out the month of April. This is the title poem in Search of a Horizon. The nearest sea to us in Dublin is Sandymount Strand, which I'm sure you all know of. It has been immortalised by James Joyce. And it's very often, like, it's seldom that the tide is right in at Sandymount, and there's a very long strand, and usually the tide is away out far. And it's very different, say, to down here in Connemara, where I am at the moment, where there's the Atlantic and the waves breaking against the rocks and so on. And so the sea and Sandymount Strand would have done me very nicely if I had been allowed out of the house. There's sort of I mention of when the war is over. I often mention the war in poems, or I mention soldiers, and the thing is, there will always be a war. There always is a war. There are always people dying. But the big war here, really, that I was referring to was the Second World War, during which my parents met. And when I was a young adult, people would say things to me like, "Are you a post-war, the Second World War?" So yes, I was. In Search of a Horizon. For 3 whole months now, there has been no sighting of the sea, apart from waves of longing that lap on the rocks in your mind's eye. You want to see as far as the horizon. You want to swim towards it, though you would never reach it. Even so, you know it is the journey itself, your body into the chill comfort of water, bringing you back to the beginning when the war was over and you didn't know what it was to worry. In other words, bringing you back, I suppose, to even before you were born when you're swimming in the amniotic fluid. This fourth poem I'll read now, A Giant Step on Behalf of the Elderly, is a little echo of Neil Armstrong there landing on the moon when he took a giant step. And after, when the country began to open up again, the public parks, there was a certain time allocated for the elderly people to visit the parks between, say, 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon. And, you know, there are 3 very small parks near us, and I couldn't wait to get out and to walk through them. But however, they were full of young people who obviously hadn't read these notices and who hadn't realized they were supposed to vacate the parks and let the old people in. And then I mentioned different shoes that I used to wear. French word here, gutties. Gutties are little canvas shoes with rubber soles, and it's a North of Ireland word. And when I used to go there on my holidays as a child, my aunt would say, "Oh, I have to buy you a pair of gutties." So I think that's the only thing that I need to explain about this poem. A giant step on behalf of the elderly. At last, you step over the threshold, crossing from the safety of home. You head for the park during the time allocated to you and are surprised to see that everyone has become younger. Their skin is smooth, their limbs supple. You imagine that you too have returned to your childhood. Watch as your Oxford brogues transform to stiletto heels, to platform shoes, Greek sandals, gutties, stretching all the way back to the day your mother would leave on the windowsill to dry before allowing you out to play. Okay, thank you very much, Gisele. And of course, all those poems that were written in Irish in Gaelic first, and those are the English translations.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Such new poems. Excellent. Thank you very much. I was going over our past conversations in interviews. I had the privilege of interviewing you for the Abbey Journal once. And I think there you mentioned about the need to be a writer activist, which you consider yourself to be. I mean, you're there for the rights of poets and for poetry to be more socially widespread. Do you think your latest book, the ones from where these poems come, are part of this activism? How activist are you with the pandemic? You become more of an activist or less of an activist after pandemic? How do you feel?
I suppose the thing about these poems, they're personal. You know, this is how I felt when I was. When I think they're accessible, that people will identify with what I'm saying in them, and I suppose, yeah, some of them would be kind of more activist or political, perhaps. There's a poem there about the Olympic torch, and that's a reference. It references the poem that I wrote as part of a PEN international relay when the Olympic Games were being held in Beijing. I translated a poem of written by a Chinese poet who was being held in prison at that time. And I suppose another poem I reference all those nameless people who were buried in New York. They were being buried, you know, unnamed in pine boxes. And I suppose then there's a prose poem then. Yeah, I suppose there's quite a lot of activist, if you like, poems Gisele, the Native Americans, the Navajo tribe in particular. So yeah, I suppose I can't get away from being political, but whereas I would have in other collections, I would have poems written, to or for or about poets who are political prisoners, or for instance, I have a poem about Daphne, the Galicia Coruna, I think is her full name. I can't pronounce it right. She was a Maltese 5 years ago, I think, and I'll be reading that in London next month at a PEN event. So does that long-winded answer your question?
Yes, but I'm also wondering how, looking back at your life as both a poet and teacher, you were pretty much involved into other people's writings, yeah, having other people write. And I think maybe, and this is a question, over the years you've become more subjective into your poetry and less of an activist. But this is not what we talked about in the previous interview. For those who haven't read it yet, it's in the Abbey Journal. But so, just in case you want to comment, I'm curious.
I think I have a book coming out. It's with the copy editor at the moment. It's new and it's in Irish. It's just in Irish. But I can give you the translations, and it's poems from all the 10 collections and new poems. Now those new poems in particular, I found that they're very kind of drawing on memory and very kind of close to autobiography. But in the past I worked, the book you mentioned, A Lesson in Cant, that was inspired by members of the traveling community. And during that time, I helped many of the young girls write poems. And those poems they tended to be about the man they loved, the man they were going to marry, or about a sick relative of theirs, usually a sibling who had died. There was a fair amount of illness among the traveling community, and many of the girls had lost a sibling to one illness or the other. This would help them to grieve, to have this poem, and they would often bring it down to the campsite and then get photocopies made and pass them around. So that it was a great privilege to do that kind of work. And I have also taught and given workshops, and I have been an activist in that I was 4 years there. I've just recently stood back from being the chair of Aontas na Scríbhneoirí Gaeilge, which is the lobby of Irish, looking for, fighting for our rights basically, and looking for good conditions, and that for writers in Irish, which is after all a minority language. So.
Thank you. If you had to send a message to poets, maybe some of our folks from UFI are also poets. Maybe other people watching from outside UFI might get inspired, not only with your writing, but also by your words. What would you say to people starting to write or writing currently, but still in the beginning of their careers? What would your message be?
I would say believe in yourself, and because I remember when I started writing poetry first, I got a lot of very negative and very hurtful feedback. And I remember talking to somebody once, an American academic, and he was saying, know when your work is good. And I didn't understand what he meant, and I couldn't begin to believe how would I ever know, and how would my work ever be good, because I kept sort of hearing all this negative stuff. But I think, you know, you have to believe in yourself, and it is always good to be part of a group, and it is always good to give and receive helpful criticism, constructive criticism, rather than DC in a workshop with somebody who is just kind of, you know, telling you your work is bad, or it's not right, or it's not going to work, or nobody wants it, or whatever. Criticism should always allow for the fact that a person has spent time working on this poem or this piece of writing, no matter how awful it is, to see the good in it and to encourage the writer.
Thank you so much. Such wise words. And at last, will poetry save us? If so, from what?
Bitch?
Do you think poetry can save us? If so, from what?
Poetry can save us. I don't know that it can. I think words can save us, and we need words, and especially in the world we're living in now, it's to reassure us and to celebrate life in spite of what may be happening.
Thank you so much. Listening to your poems, learning more about your writing process and your beliefs in words give us hope and entice us into reading more of your work and other Irish writers as well. So once again, thank you very much. And I don't know if there's any comment or question in chat. Professor Laura is entering.
Yes, well, it was very nice to listen to you reading your own poetry, Celia. It is something that brings the sounds of the words from the poet herself. Is something that moves, I think, a lot, because, as you said, you are expressing your feelings, but when we read on our own voice, we put some of our own feelings too. So to listen to your feelings is really a very interesting and a very transforming experience, I would say, for the listener and also for the reader when they try to read your own poems. And I would like to just to ask you, you mentioned that you write first in Irish and then in English, because we always have this idea that, I said it was Joyce who said that that Irish have a bifurcated tongue. And so if you, this bifurcated tongue is this idea of two tongues at the same time in your mindset, and identifying yourself with this double language, we would say. How does your inspiration comes first? We would say first, in a way of saying, because we are always synchronic, we always want to put cause and effect, but perhaps they come simultaneously, this inspiration of themes and the words that comes to you to write.
Well, I think larger genres like a play or a novel, that's all in Irish, because I have to inhabit a whole world, the world of the novel where it's set, and the characters, and say characters from a play, they're very much in my head and they're speaking Irish. Whereas with poetry, because a poem can be very short, I would tend to write it in Irish and then have a look at it and translate it and then go. I tend to do that with poetry, but not with the larger genres. And there is a huge influence of Irish on the English we speak in Ireland, or the English my generation speaks, for instance, and especially the English my husband speaks, because he comes from a very rural part of Ireland, and his English is really Hiberno. But there recently I was writing some stories in English, and I was cutting them back and cutting them back, because that's the thing about Irish. There are very few shortcuts in Irish. You can't get away with saying things like, I was walking the dog, which something like that doesn't make sense. In particular, you can't walk a dog, but you certainly can't walk a dog in Irish, whatever about saying it in English. So I noticed that with the prose I was writing in English, that I really needed to cut back and cut back, because it was full of all these prepositions and everything that I didn't need, whereas I would have needed them in Irish.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this delightful moment of listening to your poetry. And I hope that the people, the audience that have been accompanying us today, or that they will follow you up in the evening, perhaps, because of it is recorded and it is in our website, could get this inspiration from you and to get courage to continue writing poetry or consuming poetry, in a way of saying.
Yeah.
So thank you very, very much for this moment. And I hope that all your students, Gisele, also accompany us in our next edition of Poetry at midday, not midnight, midday, and every Wednesday, the last Wednesday of the month. And next time we will be back with Susan Hoy again in our program. Thank you very much. And we'll stop our communication now.
Thank